TV show made him a lovable rogue, but the real-life Black Sheep veterans were so insulted by the series they almost took the producers to court. While Hollywood showed a band of misfits, the real Pappy Boyington was a man the Marine Corps tried to erase from history, and the truth is far darker than a 1970s sitcom. For millions of television viewers in the late 1970s, actor Robert Conrad was the definitive face of World War II aviation. Clad in a sweat-stained flight suit, chomping on a cigar, and flashing a rebellious grin, Conrad's portrayal of Major Gregory Pappy Boyington became a cultural icon. He was the leader of a wild, hard-drinking, anti-establishment squadron of Marine fighter pilots who flew their bent-wing F-4U Corsairs into the dangerous skies of the South Pacific, breaking every rule in the book while shooting down Japanese Zeros by the dozen. It was the ultimate fantasy of rebellion and redemption, wrapped in the nostalgic glory of the greatest generation. But when the real-life veterans of Marine Fighter Squadron 214 sat down in front of their television sets to watch this primetime tribute to their wartime service, they did not see a celebration of their bravery. Instead, they saw a deeply insulting caricature that threatened to erase their true sacrifices and replace them with a Hollywood comedy. They saw themselves depicted as a gang of thieving, court-martial-bound alcoholics who only cared about booze, brawling, and avoiding duty. The contrast between the polished television myth and the gritty, often tragic reality of their actual combat tour is one of the most fascinating and contentious chapters in military aviation history. Truly understand why this historical divide is so deep, we have to look closely at the massive gap between the television culture of the late 1970s and the horrific reality of the Solomon Islands campaign in 1943. When the show Baa Baa Black Sheep debuted on NBC in 1976, America was still reeling from the cultural trauma of the Vietnam War. The public was deeply cynical about military authority, government institutions, and rigid hierarchies. The show's creator, the legendary television producer Stephen J. Cannell, understood this cultural shift perfectly. He designed the series not as a strict historical documentary, but as an anti-establishment military adventure. The opening narration of the show explicitly set the stage, claiming that Boyington commanded a collection of misfits and screwballs who became the terrors of the South Pacific. This narrative of the lovable underdogs fighting both the Japanese Empire and their own military superiors was a massive hit, particularly with younger audiences who loved seeing authority figures get outsmarted. But the actual historical reality of VMF 214 was entirely different. The real Black Sheep were not a collection of outcasts salvaged from military prisons. They were highly trained, disciplined, and deeply professional Marine aviators, many of whom had college educations and came from respectable, middle-class families. They were normal replacement pilots who had been temporarily left without a squadron due to the chaotic nature of the war's logistics. To have their life-and-death struggle in the Pacific turned into a slapstick comedy about a gang of military delinquents was a bitter pill to swallow, and it set off a quiet civil war between the surviving veterans and the man who had once been their leader. To find the root of this historical distortion, we have to examine the complicated and highly self-destructive life of Gregory Pappy Boyington himself. Long before he ever took command of the Black Sheep, Boyington was a man who lived on the absolute edge of disaster. Born in Idaho in 1912, he grew up under the name Gregory Hallenbeck, only discovering later in life that his biological father was actually a man named Charles Boyington. By the late 1930s, he had become a talented Marine Corps aviator, but his personal life was a smoking ruin. He was a severe alcoholic, a notorious barroom brawler, and he possessed a truly staggering amount of personal debt. He was constantly hounded by collection agencies, to the point where Marine Corps headquarters required him to submit a monthly accounting of how he planned to pay off his various creditors. Desperate for a way to escape his financial ruin, Boyington made a desperate gamble in the summer of 1941. He resigned his commission in the Marine Corps to join the American Volunteer Group, better known as the Flying Tigers, in China. The recruiters were offering a massive salary of $675 a month, plus a $500 cash bonus for every confirmed Japanese aircraft shot down. For a debt-ridden pilot like Boyington, this was a fortune. But his time in China was a complete disaster. He clashed constantly with the Flying Tiger's legendary commander, Claire Chennault, who viewed Boyington as a lazy, insubordinate drunk. Boyington's flying in China was incredibly erratic. He crashed and destroyed multiple valuable P-40 fighters in careless accidents, and while he claimed to have shot down 6 Japanese planes during his time with the Flying Tigers, modern historical research and official records suggest his actual tally was likely closer to 2. When he finally resigned from the group in anger and returned to the United States just as America was reeling from the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Marine Corps initially refused to recommission him, viewing him as an unstable and dangerous liability. But here is the incredible plot twist that the television show completely glossed over, a detail that reveals just how close Gregory Boyington came to being completely erased from history. After practically begging the Marine Corps for a second chance and pulling every political string he could find, Boyington was finally allowed back into uniform. He was sent to the South Pacific as a major, but he was initially given a mundane administrative desk job. The military command wanted to keep him as far away from active leadership as possible. It was only through a desperate, bureaucratic fluke in August of 1943 that Boyington managed to convince his superiors to let him gather a group of unattached replacement pilots and form a brand new combat squadron. He knew that this was his absolute last chance at redemption. If he failed, he would be court-martialed or sent home in disgrace. This high-stakes pressure cooker is what drove him to push his men to the absolute limit. But when Boyington was eventually shot down and captured by the Japanese in January of 1944, his survival did not depend on his tactical genius or his legendary fighting spirit. It depended on his forced, brutal sobriety. For 20 months in a series of highly secretive and brutal Japanese prisoner-of-war camps, including the notorious Afuna camp, Boyington was denied a single drop of alcohol. He was subjected to regular beatings, starvation diets, and intense psychological torture. Yet he later admitted to close friends that this horrific imprisonment actually saved his life. The forced sobriety allowed his severely damaged liver and body to heal from years of acute alcohol abuse. When the war ended and he was liberated, the Marine Corps, which had assumed he was dead and had already posthumously awarded him the Medal of Honor, was suddenly faced with a massive public relations challenge. They had to celebrate a living hero who they had previously tried to drum out of the service for being an uncontrollable alcoholic. This tension between the official military hero and the deeply flawed human being is what ultimately shaped the legend of the Black Sheep Squadron. When Boyington took command of VMF 214 in late 1943, the squadron was not a collection of misfits, but rather a group of highly capable pilots who had been left in a replacement pool. The television show depicted them as a ragtag bunch of rebels who wore non-regulation clothing, ignored military discipline, and spent their free time stealing jeeps and chasing after a fictional group of nurses called the Black Sheep Defense Force. In reality, the pilots of VMF 214 were highly disciplined professionals who operated under extreme physical and psychological stress. The name Black Sheep itself was born out of a sense of shared isolation, not criminal behavior. When they first organized, the pilots originally wanted to call themselves Boyington's Bastards to reflect the fact that they were an ad hoc unit assembled from leftover pilots. However, a Marine Corps public relations officer flatly rejected the name as being entirely too vulgar for American newspapers and radio broadcasts. The pilots then decided on the name Black Sheep as a clever play on the idea of being the outcasts or the unattached members of the Marine aviation family. Under Boyington's aggressive leadership, they became a phenomenally lethal combat unit. In just 84 days of active operations, the squadron was credited with destroying 97 enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat, with many more listed as probables. Boyington was a demanding leader who taught his young lieutenants how to survive in the lethal skies over Rabaul. He taught them to never dogfight the highly maneuverable Japanese Zero on its own terms, but to instead use the heavy armor, massive firepower, and incredible diving speed of their F-4U Corsairs to execute high-speed, hit-and-run attacks. It was a highly calculated, scientific approach to aerial warfare that required immense discipline and teamwork, the absolute opposite of the reckless, individualistic flying shown on the television series. The tragedy of the Black Sheep legend is that the incredible combat record of these young men was ultimately overshadowed by the highly exaggerated stories that Boyington published in his 1958 autobiography. Facing severe financial ruin after the war, plagued by failed marriages and an immediate return to heavy drinking, Boyington wrote Baa Baa Black Sheep as a desperate attempt to make money. The book was written with a highly cynical, self-serving tone. Boyington painted himself as the lone, brilliant commander who had to constantly fight against a wall of incompetent, careerist Marine bureaucrats to get his men into the air. When Hollywood producers approached him in the mid-1970s to turn the book into a television series, Boyington eagerly signed away the rights and agreed to serve as a technical consultant on the set. For the surviving veterans of VMF 214, this was the ultimate betrayal. They watched as the television show turned their late friends and fallen brothers into comedic caricatures. Pilots like Bob McClurg, Bill Case, and other key members of the Squadron were deeply hurt to see their characters portrayed as brawlers and thieves. They argued that in the actual Solomon Islands, where aviation fuel was scarce, parts were hard to find, and the Japanese were launching daily air raids, any pilot who behaved like the characters on the show would have been immediately stripped of his wings and sent to a disciplinary barracks. The veterans felt that the show cheapened the very real terror and grief they had experienced. They had watched their closest friends spin out of control in flames over the Pacific, yet television was presenting their war as a lighthearted romp filled with beach parties and harmless hijinks. The rift between Boyington and his former pilots grew so wide that many of them refused to speak to him for years, and several veterans actively consulted with lawyers to see if they could sue Universal Television for defamation of character. To see just how far the television show departed from historical reality, we only have to look at the specific narrative structures used in almost every episode. In the series, Boyington is constantly locked in a bitter, personal feud with a fictional superior officer named Colonel Thomas Lard, played by actor Dana Elcar. Colonel Lard is depicted as a pompous, rule-bound bureaucrat who is obsessed with military decorum and is constantly trying to find a reason to court-martial Boyington and disband the Black Sheep. This made for excellent television drama, creating a classic anti-establishment conflict that resonated with 1970s audiences. But in the actual historical record, Boyington's superiors were highly supportive of him and the Squadron. Officers like Admiral William Halsey and Marine General Ralph Mitchell were fully aware of Boyington's personal flaws, but they also recognized his extraordinary capability as a combat leader. They actively protected him from bureaucratic interference because they needed his squadron to break the back of Japanese air power in the Solomons. The real-life veterans pointed out that the constant insubordination shown on television would have been completely impossible in a real wartime environment. The Marine Corps of World War II was an incredibly strict, highly disciplined organization, and no commander, no matter how many aerial victories he had, would have been allowed to openly insult superior officers or steal military supplies without facing immediate court-martial. By turning the story into a cartoonish battle between a heroic rebel and a foolish establishment, the show completely erased the complex, professional relationships that actually allowed VMF 214 to succeed in one of the most difficult military campaigns in American history. In the final analysis, the story of Gregory Pappy Boyington and the Black Sheep Squadron is not a simple, clean-cut tale of wartime heroism or Hollywood adventure. It is a deeply human, often painful narrative of a brilliant but profoundly broken man who found his absolute peak of purpose in the terrifying skies of the Pacific, only to spend the rest of his life struggling to survive under the heavy weight of his own manufactured legend. The television show gave the world a comfortable, entertaining myth that remains a beloved classic of 20th century television. But the true history of VMF 214 is far more honorable, far more tragic, and infinitely more worthy of our respect than any primetime sitcom could ever hope to capture. The real Black Sheep were not misfits or outlaws. They were ordinary young Americans who were thrust into an extraordinary, brutal conflict and who performed their duties with immense skill, discipline, and courage. If you want to understand how these brave aviators actually mastered the complex engineering of the F-4U Corsair and survived the deadly, unforgiving skies of the South Pacific, click on the video on your screen right now, where we break down the terrifying truth of the bentwing bird and the engineering secrets that made it both a pilot's dream and a lethal trap.